This is the third of our sermon series on the 23rd Psalm as we move through the Psalm. Today we look at the fourth verse. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. This is the word of the Lord. When we read this wonderful psalm, I suspect that our attention becomes riveted on that phrase, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, as the New Revised Standard Version has it. I confess that I lean toward the older translation of, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. Robert Alter, the great Hebrew scholar, in his recent wonderful translation of the Hebrew Bible, puts it this way: though I walk through the vale of death's shadow, I fear no harm, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they console me. No matter which way you say that, it's easier said than done. But then look at who wrote these words. He said it because he had done it. David, who walked into the valley facing Goliath, he is simply telling us the truth of his own life. And maybe not even that valley, for there's the dark valley of the shadow in which he faced the evil of his own sinful affair with Bathsheba and then ordered the murder of her husband. Or the valley of the shadow when he faced the armed rebellion of his son Absalom. We all have walked, will walk, are walking through those valleys in the midst of the shadows, and it's more than simply the reality of the moment of death. Some of us have walked through dark valleys this week. All of us know someone who's in a dark valley of illness, grief, uncertainty, confusion, depression, fear. And some have not been able to come out of the darkness. The darkness has taken hold and they have not been able to return to the light. That's the picture David paints with his words of a shepherd leading his flock through the dark and narrow gorge of a twisting and winding path, trying to find their way out. It's a place where wild beasts lurk, lions and tigers and bears, where bandits prowl and lie in wait to assault those who walk that path. In short, this is a place of danger in this verse. It's the real world of David the shepherd, the real world of David against Goliath, the real world of David, the powerful, pitiful king, the real world of David, the despairing parent. The question is not about whether it happens. It does. Let's be clear, though, about what this verse does not say. It doesn't say, as I walk through the dark valleys, I will not be touched by evil. Your rod and your staff will fend off any pain or suffering or bad things happen to me. No, the psalmist is very much to the point. I will fear no evil. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And that word comfort carries a deep sense of consolation in times of grief. It's not a matter of protecting us from the evil or preventing the evil from happening. We all walk that path through that dark, deep, shadowy valley. What David is talking about for us is that God hears us. God is near us as we walk on. And the thread that connects, that holds it together between fear and comfort is that affirmation of faith when he says, you are with me. And that's the root of Paul's affirmation of faith as he was writing from prison to the Philippians. For God is at work in you. He knew this for them and for himself too in his own shadowy cell. God's protection doesn't encircle us in plastic bubble wrap, but embraces us in a powerful, personal presence that penetrates our darkest moments with that peace that passes all understanding. This psalm is God's promise. As David knows the truth of it, no matter what the old hymn says, we do not walk that valley by ourselves. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And I've heard all the sermons on how the rod and the staff, how they're used as weapons to defend against and beat off all the wild animals and all the things that might happen to us. But more often than not, as the shepherd leads and cares for the flock, the rod and the staff are used to keep the flock together, to guide them on the way, to touch them, to let them know that the Good Shepherd is present, very near. The theme of this past week's Vacation Bible School, Barefoot School, says it so well, a summary statement of our text. Life is wild. God is good. And what they learned this past week is that when life is wild, when we walk through those fearful valleys, we need to be aware of what they called God sightings. And many of the children, when they were asked what a God sighting was, spoke about nature, birds and rainbows. But one little boy had a name for a God sighting: my mom. And the truth of this verse is that God is always with us, giving us strength, giving us courage to assure us that the divine presence is always bigger than, greater than any circumstance surrounding us. And if there ever was a God sighting, a good shepherd whose heart reflected the nature of God, his name was Fred Rogers, Presbyterian minister, gentle neighbor to the world. Mr. Rogers' neighborhood was where we knew we could, our children, our grandchildren, could walk without fear, finding comfort in his words and presence and gentle embrace. Anthony Bresnikan tells of a time back in 1996 when he was a student at the University of Pittsburgh, in his words, struggling, lonely, dealing with a lot of broken pieces in myself, rudderless. And if that's not tough enough, his grandfather had just died, the one person to whom he could go and talk about this dark valley in which he found himself. He said he was walking out of his dorm room one morning and heard the TV playing in the common room, the familiar music of his childhood, "Won't You Be My Neighbor?" And he watched the full show of this rerun and says it was like a cool hand on a hot head, and he left feeling a whole lot better. Then several days later, he got in an elevator in the student union, and the doors opened, and there was Mr. Rogers himself. They nodded each other, rode down in silence, and when the doors opened, as they stepped out into the lobby, Anthony turned to Mr. Rogers and stammered out, "Mr. Rogers, I don't want to bother you. I just wanted to say thanks." And Mr. Rogers turned to him and smiled at him and said, "Did you grow up as one of my television neighbors?" And Mr. Rogers said, "It's good to see you again, neighbor," and opened his arms, inviting this young man, walking in a shadowy valley, in for a hug. But the story doesn't end there. They made small talk as they walked out of the building, but just before they got out, as Mr. Rogers was opening the door, Anthony told him how he had watched that rerun and how much it had helped him through a very difficult time. And as Mr. Rogers opened the door to leave, he turned to him and said, or Anthony turned to him and said, "Again, thanks for that, again." He says, Mr. Rogers nodded and let the door shut, and then unbuttoned his coat and motioned over to a ledge by a window where he sat down, asked Anthony to sit there with him. Mr. Rogers asked him, "Do you want to tell me what was upsetting you?" So he sat and told him the story of how his grandfather had died. It was one of the few good things he had, and he felt now so all alone, so helpless. And he says Mr. Rogers began telling him about his grandfather, how he still missed him, still wished he was there when he needed him. You'll never stop loving, you'll never stop missing the people you love, Mr. Rogers told him. They talked some more, and at the end, Anthony says he told him thank you again, probably for the 50th time. He apologized if he made Mr. Rogers late for wherever we was headed. But Fred Rogers just smiled and said in his slow, gentle, neighborly way, sometimes you're right where you need to be. All I know is that when I've been in that dark valley and fear shadows every step of the way, it's not a matter of counting my favorite things or counting our blessings. What really matters is that we are seen and heard and know that we are loved. When we're in that valley between the fearful evil and the need for comfort, we can look up and say, you are with me. But then we can look down and around and all around us and have a God sighting, to feel God's promise and presence, especially in who is sitting next to us, right where they need to be for us, in that when life is wild, God is good. Or to put it another way, there are so many people who are hanging on by a thread, and maybe you are that thread where you are right where you need to be to bring light and love and comfort to any and all who walk in their darkest valley. Men, women, especially children who are caught in the deep valleys of life gone wrong. And this psalm is their psalm as much as it is yours and mine. You know this, you believe this, and now maybe more than ever is when we need to live this. For those people who feel so alone, so helpless, in the veil of death's shadow, who need a God sighting, for you and me to be where we need to be for them. Alden Solvay, in a recent prayer he wrote, offers this: bless those who offer their lives to human rescue. Grant them fortitude to battle in the name of the unknown, the unseen, those who cannot be forgotten. May the work of their hands never falter, nor despair deter them from their holy calling. Should that not be our calling? Human rescue for all who walk in the valley of the shadow of death. To God be the glory.